afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Our speaker today is someone I'm sure all of you know. It would take me a long time to list his many achievements in biological research, as well as his tireless advocacy on behalf of sound science education, in particular the teaching of evolution, the protection of the environment, liberal politics, and of course, the separation of church and state, and the promotion of the atheist worldview. I will instead share a fact that you may not know, and that being Dr. P.Z. Myers is largely responsible for bringing me to you. The occasion was a talk given by intelligent design advocate Michael Behe at the University of Minnesota. Naturally, as soon as I saw the ad in the Minnesota Daily, I logged on to his blog, Feringula, to see if PZ was coming. That blog is responsible for bringing me, and I suspect many, many other atheists, out of the closet. And it was because I knew that PZ was coming and that I wanted to meet him that I went to Michael Behe's presentation and suffered through it, which led to my meeting August and Rachel and ultimately Minnesota Atheists, and my joining Minnesota Atheists about a month or so later. P.Z. Myers received his PhD from the Institute of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon and is an expert in the cellular and molecular mechanisms that drive brain function. Today he speaks to us on There Are No Ghosts in Your Brain, Materialist Explanations for the Mind and Religious Belief. Please join me in welcoming Dr. P.Z. Myers.
Thank you. Okay, well, thanks. I hope I don't have to drive people through Mike Behe's talks to get them to join Minnesota Atheists, but okay, well, what I want to talk about today, let me give you a little preview just in case people get bored and want to bail out, because I'm covering a lot of ground here. But basically this talk is going to be in two parts. First part, what I want to talk about is really fundamental issues in neuroscience that I want to give you this very basic primer in what we're interested in neuroscience, what we're interested in how the brain works. And the message here is going to be that the materialist research paradigm has worked very, very well. That there is no reason to postulate anything beyond electrochemistry and interesting physiological phenomena in explaining how the mind works. Okay, so that's the no ghosts in the brain there. And then because this is an atheist group, everyone here assumes, right, the materialist paradigm. You guys don't need to be lectured on that. The next part I want to talk about is some hypotheses for the evolution of religion, which is a fairly hot topic right now. There's a number of researchers doing projects on this particular problem. So the first part is going to say, okay, there are no ghosts, there are no demons, there are no gods in your brain. There's chemistry in your brain. And in the second part, I'm going to ask the question, okay, if there are no souls and demons and things, why do so many people believe in them? And so we're going to try and address that a little bit. That last part, I will admit right at the beginning, is going to be a little unsatisfactory, because the first thing I'm going to tell you is that we don't know. But we'll see what comes out. I'll tell you a little bit about how people are thinking about this. Okay, so what's going on in your brain? Well, let's be really reductionist and look at the individual components of the brain first. This is a pretty picture of a pyramidal neuron from the cortex of a rat. So this is a single cell, okay? Your brain is filled to the brim with all kinds of cells. Estimates are that there are roughly 10 to the 11th, so 100 billion cells in your brain. Lots and lots of these things. They don't all look like this, but this is a fairly representative one. What you've got going on in there is you've got these cells, and they have connections all over the place. That's why they look so spiky. In this particular cell, this stuff down at the bottom, these are dendrites, and they're reaching out all over in the local neighborhood. What you don't see in this particular picture is there's a whole bunch of neurons all in a big cloud here. So this is all reaching out, touching all these other neurons. And then in addition, there is something called an axon, which is a long process that goes out to some other destination. So it's all cabling. Lots of little tiny itty-bitty wires all over the place. These wires are, this stuff here, it's about 1/10 of a micron in diameter. So really tiny, fine cables everywhere. We know what those are doing. This whole science of neurophysiology has been working out the details for about 50 years now, and we've got a pretty good handle on how an individual neuron works. And I'm going to show you this little cartoon. Don't worry too much about the details. Nothing I'm going to say here today is going to be too demanding on the science ends of things. But basically what you can do with these neurons is you can go into little bitty electrodes, and you can stick them into the cell, and you can record the electrical activity going on. What this is just illustrating is, there's a neuron. Is it really that fuzzy? Well, anyway, there's a neuron there, like that pyramidal neuron in the last picture. And over here on this side, there's some diagrams of what we record. So when you stick these electrodes in there, what you measure is the electrical potential. So it's all electricity we're messing with here. And what you see inside the neuron is patterned activity. That it goes from a mostly negative voltage, fires up to a somewhat positive voltage, and back down again. And that's what these little spikes are that you see in these diagrams over here. And where information is encoded is that pattern of spikes. So what we have is waves of electrical signals going down through the axons to other targets. If you take a basic neurophysiology course, you will get to do fun things that I did back in my graduate days, where, for instance, you will record from sensory neurons in a cockroach. You just put a wire down there, you record what they're doing, and you'll see these little potentials there. That what you can do is then, for instance, if you've got a sensory neuron that's connected to one of the little hairs on the cockroach, you blow on the cockroach, and it causes changes in the sensory organ, and then these little pulses of activity go firing down there. And if you're really good, you also get an electrode into the central nervous system, and you record from motor neurons that go to their little legs, for instance. And what you can see is cause and effect. You blow on the cockroach, you see this little pattern of squiggles in your oscilloscope firing down the nerve, and it reaches this motor neuron, and the motor neuron responds by making more little squiggles, and those go out to the legs, and if you don't have the cockroach pinned down, it tries to scuttle away. So it's all wired together. We know this very well. And like I said, it's all electrochemistry. Everything at the neurobiological level is physics and chemistry. I'm teaching this course this fall, and my students are going to be in a state of shock because they're going to walk in there expecting, biology, natural history, we're going to describe things. No, what we do is we throw equations at them, we sit down with physics and chemistry, and we work out all the details of dawn and equilibrium and all this stuff that I'm sparing you today. But it's all very concrete, very mathematical, very physical. Okay, what are those neurons doing? So far we've looked at individual neurons, and we see electrical activity flying all over the place. What neurons have to do is they have to talk to one another. So what neurons do is they make these things called synapses. So that's what we're seeing diagrammed here. This big blob there is one of those pyramidal neurons with its little spiky dendrites and its axons all over the place. And I told you that there's an axon that goes off somewhere and contacts something else. While other neurons are sending out axons and contacting that pyramidal neuron. And this is just a close-up diagram of what's going on there. And what's going to happen here is all kinds of complicated stuff. Synapses, this is called a synapse, is a place where an electrical signal is going to be transduced into a chemical signal, and then it's going to induce an electrical signal in the next cell. And this allows for some amazing flexibility. What you can do at a synapse, for instance, is, unlike, if you think of electricity, you imagine, well, you just give things shocks, right? Zap. With chemical signals, you can do all kinds of fancy stuff. Chemical signals can transmit across a synapse, and they can tell the target cell to get excited, just like a little zap. But they can also tell the target cell to be inhibited, slow down. So we can put brakes on cells with these connections. We can do some really elaborate stuff that has been discovered in the last 20 years or so. You can have changes occur at the synapse that tell the cell to change its pattern of gene transcription. That can tell the cell to rewire itself. So there's a lot of complexity and specificity going on at these synapses. This is what the cells are doing. They're talking to each other through these connections, and they're modifying each other's behavior. So when you look at a single cell, you say, oh, well, we can comprehend that. We can do the chemical formulas and figure everything out. And we can look at the recordings and we can see the electrical potentials moving around. What we find is that as you get to a higher level, as you start looking at how cells talk to each other, it gets more and more complex. It gets awesomely complex at this point. Because now you can have all kinds of emergent behaviors arising from all these complicated interactions. However, at the same time, what we don't see is any new phenomena coming into play. I have never yet witnessed an angel reaching in and tickling a synapse to make it do something. What you can do is you can trace everything to physical events. The fact that these physical events are incredibly complex is what gives rise to the complexity of the human mind. Not something magical reaching in outside of it. Okay, this is blurry, which is good. I don't want you to read this. But I just want you to know that modern neurobiological research is getting ever more complicated. This is from the work of a guy named Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for puzzling out how learning and memory works. And what's going on here in all these little arrows, what we're looking at here is a single neuron, and it's got these synapses, a couple of synapses here from other cells that are talking to it, and these are sending chemicals across to the synapses. And what this diagram is illustrating is a network of protein interactions that occur. And it's amazing stuff. So these chemicals come across, and you can, for instance, in this particular case, what they're talking about is that if you get synchronous activity at a couple of different synapses, the neuron will remodel itself and strengthen the contacts. So the neuron is responding to activity in other cells. So that's what's going in your brain right now, is I'm talking at you, and there's all kinds of little pulses flying all over the place inside of your brain. And some of those pulses are saying, shut everything down and forget about this guy, it's really boring, and that's okay. And some of you are picking up on new information, and it's telling neurons to modify themselves and store this information for a future date. And all that's being figured out using this physical materialist paradigm. Okay. So that's just a brief overview of what cells are doing in the brain. It does get a lot more complicated. Like I said, it's not single cells. It's lots of cells working together. And it can get bewildering. This is a picture of just a field of neurons, and only a subset of the cells are labeled here. Not all of them are labeled. This is just dense with cells. Like I said, 100 billion cells all packed into your brain. On top of that, each of these cells is making roughly 1,000 contacts with other cells in the neighborhood. So we're talking about 100 trillion synapses all working together. Do we understand this? No, we do not. I don't want to give you the impression that we know everything about the brain. We sure don't. We know very well what things are going on at a low level. We know what's going on with neurons, individual cells, and we're knowing what's going on with small networks of cells. And we're seeing clearly that there are bigger networks of cells. And one of the things neurophysiologists do is they try to map out all the connections, all the cables that are running everywhere. But we don't quite understand everything that's going on in there. What we do is we've got this lower level worked out fairly well. Middle level, totally confusing, just way too complicated. But then we also have a top-down approach. So we also try to look at things rather from the perspective of the cell, but from the perspective of the organism. And that's also a valid and legitimate part of neuroscience. We do experiments like this one. Okay. You know, Gary Larson was making this joke in this cartoon, and it was so funny to a lot of neurophysiologists because this is exactly what we do. It was no joke at all. But yeah, this is a fairly common thing in neurobiological research. I mean, in my case, I work on animals, but there are people who work on people, and they do similar sorts of things. If you ever go in for a neurosurgery, they may have you sign a little release form that says, can we poke in your brain a little bit while we're doing this? And, it's okay to say no, but oftentimes this is also part of the process of trying to figure out, if they're going into your brain for surgery, there's something wrong, and part of the process of trying to figure out what is going in and poking around and stimulating and seeing what kinds of things are going on. And yes, there are regions of your brain where if you poke them, if you stimulate them, you can make the guy kick his leg out or do whatever. There's all kinds of fun little things you can play with in there. And using this kind of approach, you can map out different regions of the brain that have different roles in neurological function. So this again, is kind of a crude picture. It's a rough picture of what's going on. Like I said, there's a whole middle ground of complexity we don't understand yet. We're still puzzling our way through it. But yeah, we can map out various regions of the brain, and this is just illustrating those. Temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, frontal lobe. There's all kinds of nice little names. And we can know what these things do. It's not just people reaching in and poking them, but also things like trauma. The Iraq War, I'm sure, is teaching people all kinds of new things about what the brain does, because we've got soldiers coming home with pieces of their brain damaged. And we figure out what piece is broken, what part of their life is demolished, and we can correlate the two. For instance, in World War I, people worked out, hey, this region back here, back of the head, if you have brain injury back here, you're bringing home a soldier who is blind. This is the area of your brain that processes visual information. We can also work out things like, here's temporal lobe. This is an auditory area. So that's this area right in here, and that handles hearing. There's a somatosensory association area up there. So back up in here. It's an area that's kind of integrating lots of information. There's a motor cortex and a sensory cortex that I'll talk about in a moment. There we can map out in ever finer detail what's going on. But we can sort of see what different pieces of this brain are doing. Yes?
What part is what people call the reptilian brain?
That's kind of a misnomer. This particular diagram is just looking at the cortex, which is this big frontal region of the brain that in human beings is so greatly large it folds over everything. If you look at something like a rat, I'll show you a picture in a moment of a rat. It's a simpler brain. This part isn't as large, and we're talking when we talk about lizard brains and so forth, they're talking about deeper parts of the brain. Okay, so here's this complicated structure. We've worked out this coarse map. We can do finer maps. So what I'm going to show you in the next picture is we're going to take a slice like this through the brain, and we're going to fold it over so you can look at the surface of the brain in cross-section, and we're going to look right around that motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. So this is a famous picture. This is the homunculus, where, remember, there's this motor cortex and the sensory cortex. I briefly mentioned those. This is the part that the Gary Larson cartoon was poking. Okay, there's a strip called the motor cortex, and there's a particular region of this cortex that's associated with the lower limbs, for instance. And so you can imagine this little map here. So over here is the motor cortex mapped onto the surface of this brain, like this, right? And it's done as a drawing of a human being. And what you can see is where is the leg? It's up there. It's way up near the midline. So you can imagine Gary Larson sitting there, right here, just pumping away at that. That would make the leg kick out. And you can see where the other regions are mapped out. And the cute thing about this is that you can see the proportion of your brain that's dedicated to particular functions. So motor cortex, hands, right? These are very dexterous things, so there's lots of cells dedicated to controlling these fine movements of your hands. In addition, the face, all this mobility of expression, things like speech, there's a huge portion dedicated to that. And the other parts are significantly smaller. This other side is a sensory homunculus. So that's motor. You poke this, poke parts of this, and people will kick out their legs or fling their arms around or whatever. This side is the sensory homunculus. And that works in the opposite. If you take that, if you poke into those, and the patient is conscious, they won't move their limbs. They'll report, hey, you're tickling my leg. So they will feel these sensations being transmitted there. So we've got these fine-grained maps of what function is being carried out by what region in particular parts of the brain. Yeah?
I think I remember from high school biology that they told us that really it was at the surface level on the cortex that most of the actual activity is taking place, and you kind of tell relative between animals by how much folding there is.
Exactly.
Yes, so this stuff is all going on superficially. So we've got a map laid out over the surface. And so you increase the complexity of a brain by increasing the amount of surface area. That's why we're so wrinkled in there. And so everything's going on the surface. And then remember those neurons I showed you? There's neurons all over in those surface things. Those pyramidal neurons are sitting there with their little spiky bits reaching up into those surface areas. And then they project deeper. So deeper parts of the brain are communication areas where we've got all kinds of little cables shuttling all over the place. Now, if you've looked at the back of your computer and you see that tangle of wires, that's deeper parts of the brain here, only magnified a millionfold. Okay, so we kind of worked out roughly what's going on in the brain. And again, no angels make an appearance. It's all physical stuff. We can trigger behaviors there. Another approach we can take is we can take a comparative approach. We can ask what's going on in other animals. You know, if humans have a soul and chimpanzees don't, let's see if we can find the location. So for centuries, people have been poking around in brains trying to figure out what makes people special. And it's always been very distressing to some people that when they poke around, we aren't special. We're pretty much the same. It's just it's not a qualitative difference, it's a quantitative difference. So we've made this great big huge outfolded cortical region, but it's pretty much the same as what you find in other animals. So this is a comparative diagram. So what this is illustrating is the areas where we find particular things. So down here, there's a human being. And that black area up there, that's the motor cortex. That little hatched area there, that's the sensory cortex that we were just talking about. And you can see that those just make strips along the middle of the brain. Then there are other regions we figured out, like the visual area over there, an olfactory region, and so forth. And then there's these huge white areas. Those are called associational cortex. Oh boy, this is another place where we see the boundaries of our understanding. Associational cortex is this term that gets thrown around to say, oh, we don't know what that does. Okay, so there's big chunks of the brain. We don't know quite what they do. They're called associational cortex because what seems to be going on there is that they're making connections. That what's going on there is, for instance, to manage speech. Speech is a pretty complicated thing. It turns out there's all kinds of visual inputs. There is auditory inputs, of course. There's cognitive inputs. There's motor factors, and they all feed together into one particular place. And so speech centers, for instance, end up in the associational cortex because what they're doing is they're making associations. But look at those other animals. So there's a rat, a tree shrew, and a tarsier monkey. And what you find is pretty much the same pieces are in all of those animals too. But the difference is just those white areas. You can see sort of a progression of enlargement to the human side where we've got this increase in associational cortex. And it just means we've got brains that are a little bit more flexible, that are better at making connections. But we don't think there's anything new or magical that's been added. Unless you want to say that all that white stuff is the soul and they have a smaller one than we do. But we don't. This is an atheist group. I don't have to worry about that. Okay. So anyway, the message I want to give you here is neuroscience has been making a lot of progress. We've been learning all kinds of amazing things. We know, the bottom level very, very well. We know the top level fairly well. We're making this deep plunge into that middle region I said is poorly understood. We're making progress. This is the materialist paradigm. It's working really well. So I want to endorse that. Support your local scientists. We're making progress, much more so than your local minister in figuring out what's going on in the brain. Okay, so let's just, yes?
So you've got locations way out to more physical going
Yes.
When someone's engaged in, say, abstract thought, like, is there a God? Where's the activity?
It's all over the place. If you read the current literature, what you'll see is a big issue right now is this thing called functional MRI, where they're doing magnetic resonance imaging, and you can actually visualize activity going on in the brain when they're doing abstract things like putting together puzzles or doing exercises like philosophical exercises. There's a spectacular paper out there where they've got people doing sex in the MRI, and you can see what's going on. It's really cool stuff. But anyway, the things are lighting up all over the place. Oh, yeah. Oh, come on. There's got to be some cognitive. Yeah. So anyway, there's all this fun stuff going on in the brain. And what you find is things light up all over the place. And you can't map it to any one single location. That, like I mentioned for speech, what you do in speech is your brain has got all these connections, and you know the operator in there is making connections for you and wiring things together, and you see patterns of activity all over the place. They tend to be localized in particular regions for particular functions. That is, you see more activity in certain regions of the frontal cortex when you're reading versus when you're listening to a radio tape, for instance. But there's general patterns that you can see. So yeah. And also, if you put a monkey in there, you can do the same sorts of things, and you see similar patterns lighting up.
I have a question about the history of the brain.
Uh-huh.
The human brain has changed in the last 500 years, 1,000 years.
Not that we can tell. No.
Does it differ between region or race, or I know male and female it does slightly, but I don't really understand.
That's subtle. There are regions of the brain where you see sexual dimorphism. That is, where you see patterns of cells that are slightly different between women and men, for instance. But they tend to be confined to particular areas. And then, again, it's not too surprising because, of course, we also see overt physical differences from the outside. So there's a few differences on the inside. Racial differences have not been detected. We can't find anything that's distinct between them. There's slight differences in size and so forth, but no fundamental changes.
Why do we have such brilliant people and other people that aren't?
Oh, as a college professor, I wish I knew the answer. Yeah. Education's a big one, but also there's, there are subtle physical effects on development of the brain that you see concrete differences from that. But I think for the most of it is differences in interest, differences in focus, and differences in education is a big one.
Oh. That are so smart. The board, I think, they've done some studies using the functional MRI to try to prove that carnal nuns, when they're in a meditative state, they had activity.
Yes.
Associated area, which was proving that they were communing with God. And the question is, if they're not so smart, people who's writing a book that they're so very.
Oh dear. Yes, there are several people who are trying to somehow pin these patterns of activity on metaphysical phenomena. I don't know how they're doing it. I mean, we see these differences in activity, but they are physical differences in activity. And we can also induce them with things like epileptic seizures do the same thing. They induce particular regions of the brain to have hyperactivity, and we see expression of interesting phenomena from that. So that's a leap. Yeah. Yes?
Well, you had said something about it's quantity, not quality. Number of cells, so forth. And this last question I brought up, in other words, it's not hard and fast that the more cells, the more intelligence?
Definitely not. It seems counterintuitive, but we have so much excessive quantities of brain up here that it seems like it doesn't make a big difference. The important thing to generate intelligence, we think, is differences in connectivity. How is the brain wired together? And so it's not going to be expressed in terms of bulk. It's going to be expressed in terms of something about the refinement of the connections, and we don't have a way to measure that right now. So another one, yeah.
I mean, a good way to read intelligence, maybe it would be the emergent properties of the brain itself that would determine that?
Right.
Is it more so an illusion with the brain as it would be like, we know that a Lego is constructed of atoms and we can reduce that. the emergent property that we see of a Lego, and our mind constructs that shape. I mean, is it basically an illusion that we're trying to get to the middle ground out of it now?
Yes, yes, and the Lego model is a good idea to think of this. That what we've got with our brain is we've got a nice Lego set up here. We got lots of little pieces, and what makes a difference is how your brain is assembled, how you put together those pieces into a functional unit, and that's going to differ from person to person. Okay, yes?
Has anyone studied the concept of consciousness that human beings are aware of when they're alive and breathing?
Yeah, that's that middle ground. That's scary stuff. That's really hard stuff. Yeah, right now that's mainly the domain of philosophers, and you will find a lot of philosophical work. You'll also find cognitive psychologists who are doing work on this. Is how do you take something where you've got this, this mechanical hardwiring of all kinds of little bits and pieces, and how do you get something as complex as consciousness arising from that? And we don't have an obvious physical substrate for consciousness. It's like we've been throwing this word around, emergent. It's an emergent property of many different pieces. And figuring out exactly what's causing it is, we don't know yet. So somebody else over here had a question?
What's olfactory stuff? Do we have?
Do we have olfactory? Oh, yes, we do. The olfactory stuff here is all tucked way down in here. We've had this massive reduction of olfactory inputs. Our olfactory lobe is tiny compared to these other animals, which sort of makes sense. Yes?
I really wanted to talk about consciousness. I mean, most of the people who would argue for ghost and machine kind of thing would be basing that argument on things like consciousness and free will.
Yes.
We'd be talking about our brains having olfactory capacity, motor capacity, you talk about other things. And you really don't have explanations, physical explanations of that yet.
Right.
Complete on responding to their argument.
Yes. Yeah, if you want to talk about that, you are better off bringing in a cognitive psychologist or a philosopher, and they can tell you all about that. My argument would be, however, that at some point, whatever process generates consciousness is going to have to interact with these merely physical sorts of substrates of the brain. And I fully expect that what's going to happen is going to be a consequence of more physical interactions in the brain. It's not going to be a ghost in the machine. But I cannot prove that it is not. Nobody can yet. Let's just say it's unlikely, and everything sort of points in the direction of the promising way to figure it out is to continue poking into the brain and figure out what's happening there. Yes?
I think when they were told you that the fact that the brain is so complicated is proof of God.
Yes, of course. Yes, that's a very common trope, that complexity is assumed to be an outcome of design. And I always reply back, no, it's not. Simplicity is the outcome of design. Simplicity and elegance are the hallmarks of design. And this gamish, that's evolution right there.
Yeah.
Which is a nice segue into what I want to talk about next. Okay, so here we got this wonderfully complex brain that's doing all these marvelous things. But we're saying it's all based on physical properties of matter. The next question is, okay, why do so many people think there has to be a ghost in the machine? That's a trickier one. And that one, I'm going to tell you right off, this is the one we're going to have some unsatisfactory answers to. The question is, why do people believe in this? And there's a huge number of researchers out there who are trying to make an argument that there is an evolutionary explanation for this. Okay, so I want to talk about reasons we might evolve a sense of religion, why we might believe in gods, why we might believe in spirits. And this is going to get a little out there. And before I do that, though, I first have to spell out some important terms and some important concepts that we use when we're trying to analyze the adaptive significance of things like religion. So there's a couple of words for you. Function. Okay, a function should be obvious. Does it work? Does it do something? Does it do something interesting? Does it do something helpful for the organism? So that's one of the first steps we take, is when we look at a behavior, when we look at a feature in the organism, we ask, does this do the animal any good, and what does it use it for? That's a really reasonable thing to do. That's a good starting place. However, there's a little risk there. You mentioned this business of people always ask me, well, you see all this complexity, does that mean there's design? People do the same thing with function. You see function, you immediately put into your head this idea there was some intent. The animal has that function because he was intended to have that function, that there was something driving the organism to develop that particular function. And that's not always true. There's a hard concept to get across to people, that lots of things will have function, but they didn't evolve to have that function. There are alternative explanations, and some of those are up there. Okay, the first one that everyone thinks of is adaptation. The reason you have this function is the animal was selected for it, that there was evolution in action going on. That animals that had this particular function built into their brain, for instance, this behavior in their brain, like religion or whatever, had a selective advantage, thrived, had more children, the children inherited the feature, and it evolved that way. So that's an adaptive explanation. But there are alternatives. Another one is exaptation. That is, sometimes features in the organism evolve for something completely different than you think. Now, they had some other function, or they had no function at all. They spread through a population, and then something in the environment changed, and wow, this is kind of a useful feature to have. I'll give you an example in a moment. And the other one is that it's a byproduct. So it's a byproduct of some other process. It has no adaptive function at all. We may give it a function, we may find some use for it, but it really didn't have any role to play in evolution. It just came along for the ride. So let me give you an example to explain some of these processes. There's a guy at the University of Washington, a very interesting fellow, who's a neuroscientist and an evolutionary biologist, and he's got a hypothesis about the evolution of the human brain. It's not a hypothesis I entirely buy. It's kind of an interesting idea, but anytime somebody tells you they've got one answer to how things evolved, you kind of say, nah, that's probably not it. But his hypothesis is, it's called the throwing hypothesis. Now, you imagine your caveman ancestors or whatever living on the savannah. How do they make a living? Well, they got to get out there and they got to throw sharp sticks at antelope. Turns out this is a complicated thing. You know, we don't even think about it, but throwing a spear or a rock with accuracy is a difficult thing. You got to compute all this stuff. You got to figure out how the antelope is running. You got to figure out how much force you can put behind the spear. You have to figure out where's the wind coming from. You have to adjust all these factors, and you have to do it really fast, because if you don't do it in this fraction of a second, the antelope is gone. And he's saying that one way you can do that is by redundancy. That what you do is you build up this huge complex of neurons, all working in parallel to solve this particular problem. So that's what's happening. You're looking at the antelope, boom, a whole bunch of neurons are firing at mad, doing these rapid calculations really fast so that you have a chance of having dinner that night. That's an adaptive description of a problem. That having this particular feature of increasing the number of neurons doing a calculation gives you a better chance of surviving, gives you a better chance of eating. Okay, what about all this other stuff? So we've got a function. It's to throw, and throw accurately. We've got an adaptive reason for it. Lets you eat, lets you survive, lets you pass on those genes to children. What about exaptation and this byproduct idea? Well, one thing he argues is that, you know, what could happen then is you're expanding this part of your brain that does calculations. And what's happening is you've acquired this great ability to throw spears very accurately, but at the same time what you've acquired is an intuitive ability to calculate. And what does that do? That means later on in the game, when things like mathematics are discovered, you've got a natural aptitude for it. You've got a brain that evolved to throw spears, but now you find that those same substrates of the brain are really useful in trigonometry. Okay? So that's one argument. That's an argument about an exaptation, that a lot of our higher functions are a consequence of selection for a particular process. What about the byproduct idea? Well, the byproduct idea is a little different. It's subtly different. That is, if you imagine you're selecting for all these nice little right brain behaviors, you know, being able to calculate and estimate and throw things and having spatial senses, all this right brain stuff, and there's selection to enlarge this part of your brain. People with bigger right brains do a better job catching antelope. Well, it's easier to have, in an evolutionary sense and in a developmental sense, to just say, well, we'll just tweak this little parameter in the genome that makes the whole brain bigger, just to get this effect. So left brain gets carried along with it. Okay, so in this case, the byproduct is that here you're evolving a brain that's getting bigger and bigger to kill antelope, and at the same time it happens to be coincidentally having this byproduct of making the left brain bigger, which is great for things like linguistic abilities. And then what you find is a few thousand years later, you've got a whole bunch of people who are poetic artillerymen. It's just bringing those things together. So that's a byproduct. And we think there's lots of things where this kind of stuff happens, that you have evolution for a particular function, and it just happens because developmental processes and evolutionary processes aren't that precise, that other things get dragged along for the ride. Okay. So here's an example of something we want to consider here. You know, I thought this was timely. Anybody know who that is? J.K. Rowling. Okay. Yes, you can show the book over there. This is just a kind of counterexample of one of the problems we have. We've got this person right here. And she's making a fortune, right? She's an amazing success. And her books are very popular. She's doing very well. So we want to ask the question, well, hey, maybe writing fantasy novels is an adaptation. I know, it's far-fetched. Sit with me. Okay, just go with me a little further. There is an analogy, of course, to religion being just another kind of fantasy writing. But anyway, so here's a story.